Hey there guys, this is Rob. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a fantastic day. And today, we are going to be discussing some very fun Metroid Prime 4 thoughts and ideas that I've been thinking about for a long time. However, it is worth noting before we even jump into it that this is the perfect day to have a Metroid discussion because today is February 8th of 2024, which means exactly 1 year ago on February 8th of 2023, we were treated to the greatest surprise in the world, the shadow reveal of Metroid Prime Remastered. As you may or may not know, it is one of the few times I managed to catch a reaction of myself watching a Nintendo Direct when a Metroid game of some kind was revealed. It's only happened twice actually, Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime Remastered. And I had a great fun time watching that Direct and capturing a hilarious moment that people have kind of memed and laughed about pretty much the entire year since it happened. Because, boy, what a wonderful surprise. Metroid Prime, my favorite game ever made. The remaster on the Switch is the best way to play my favorite game ever made. And it's been 1 full year. That feels almost like it was 5 or 6 months ago to me, but here we are 365 days later. And Metroid Prime Remastered has been a part of our lives for 1 full trip around the sun. What a great thing. And like I said, it's a great segue and reason for me to talk about something I've been thinking about for a while in regards to Metroid Prime 4. And it's that for all of the wonderful things that I expect Metroid Prime 4 to be and to do, I do have one major concern around what might happen if the game does release on the Switch 2. Of course, don't forget that I am currently trying to cross 25,000 subscribers, which is something I hope to do in the next coming months. I upload a few times a week, usually 2 or 3 videos every single week, and I cover a lot of Nintendo, gaming, and of course, Metroid. So if you are a Metroid fan, I certainly hope you consider subscribing. If this is your first video, I hope you subscribe, or if you've been watching for a while and not been subscribed, then I hope this video convinces you to do so. So, like I mentioned, the essence of today's conversation around Metroid Prime 4 does have to do with the assumption, and we're just going to go on the assumption today for the sake of this conversation, knowing that it could be wrong. But let's just assume, for the sake of today, that Metroid Prime 4 will be releasing on the Nintendo Switch 2 or Nintendo's next generation console, right? Which a lot of us expect, a lot of us think, we theorize, we predict, no one knows for sure, but it sure does make sense. And I've been talking about it for about 2 years, and a lot of people nowadays talk about the same thing. And of course, Metroid Prime 4 could release in, I would say, one of 3 ways. It could release as a Switch-only title, it could release as a Switch 2-only title, or what's most likely is a cross-gen title where it's going to release on both the current Switch and the next generation Switch 2. So the main thesis of this concept is that in a world where we see a cross-gen release of Metroid Prime 4, where there's a Switch and a Switch 2 version, whether they release on the same day or even if they're staggered releases, that's not even necessarily the point. If we see that happen, I think it's fair to assume that most of us would guess that, and even predict, that the next-gen Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4, in theory, should look a lot better than the current Switch version. And keep in mind, I think Metroid Prime Remastered showed us that a Metroid Prime 4 released on the Switch, if optimized, could look absolutely incredible. But shouldn't a next-generation release on the Switch 2 look even better than that? Shouldn't it just be so mind-blowing that it's maybe some of the best graphics we've ever seen? And that's what I would think. I'm expecting, if there's a Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4, that it is going to look significantly better than a current Switch version, if in fact we have a comparison to make between both generations of this game at the same time. However, this brings me to that one fear or concern that I have around a cross-gen or a next-gen release of Metroid Prime 4. And it is, if Nintendo doesn't actually make a significant visual change between a Switch version and a Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4. Now, it should be noted, this is actually something, without even realizing that I could have made like a video conversation about this, I've kind of been thinking about in the back of my brain for quite a while, ever since the ideas of a Switch and a Switch 2 co-release of Metroid Prime 4 popped into my head a few years ago, and the conversations we all have about it nowadays. I've already kind of had this concern, we'll call it, kind of burning in the back of my brain, but it's never manifested in a conversation or a statement in a video or any podcast I've ever done until this past weekend, because a few days ago, I actually appeared on my friend Andre's Restarts channel. He's got a great YouTube channel. I'm sure a lot of you guys know his. And we've been buddies for a couple years. He's been on my channel. I've been on his. And he invited me on to do like a podcast, I want to say on Saturday. And we talked about a lot of things regarding Nintendo and Switch 2 stuff. And Metroid Prime 4 we talked about quite a bit. And in just a random coincidence, it was the first time in a conversation that I organically mentioned that I've had this fear for a while. What if the Switch and Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4 don't actually look significantly different? And what if it means that we're not seeing a Switch 2 power advantage in a next-gen release of Metroid Prime 4, and that it's something that I think would be disappointing, and it's also something I could see Nintendo actually doing, and that it might be something that would be a little bit of a letdown to me. And because it came out organically on that podcast, it made me realize I've got to talk about this more in depth on my own channel in this video. Something I've referenced and showcased many times over the past few years, pretty much since this video was released, is a YouTuber known as Milky Max, who released this incredible Unreal tech demo version of the Talon 4 overworld of Metroid Prime. And you're obviously seeing a lot of that footage here, and I'm going to link it below if you want to go watch Milky Max's entire video. It's like 3 or 4 minutes. It's incredibly impressive. And Milky Max, I think I remember talking about the fact that they weren't able to code in like any morph ball animations or even the ability to shoot Samus's arm cannon. It's literally just a visual showcase of what an Unreal version of Metroid Prime could look like just for fun several years ago. And it's great, and it's impressive, and it definitely gets your minds thinking about how a Metroid Prime game could look on the right kind of hardware in like a next generation kind of release, right? And so if you look at this and compare it to what the original Metroid Prime looked like, it definitely becomes exciting. Like, in theory, a next-gen Switch 2 Metroid Prime 4 game, I think, should look bare minimum this good, if not significantly better. I think the Switch release of Metroid Prime 4 could look almost as good as this, but then hopefully the Switch 2 version, like I said, would look this good, if not even better. But again, as per the conversation and the point of this video I'm having with you now, what if Nintendo doesn't do that? What if we see a situation where both versions of the game, the Switch and Switch 2 version, again, all under the assumption that it even releases cross-generationally, what if they basically just look the same and there's minor improvements, if any, to the Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4. Maybe slight graphical improvements or lighting or texture improvements, but what if it's not so much that it's a significant difference to the naked human eye? You know, I think that we have to take a look at cross-generation releases that Nintendo has done in the past, and if you really think about it, we've only seen evidence that Nintendo tends to make them very similar, if not almost completely identical, in terms of graphics. Now, this also came up in the podcast I was referring to as well, but I think if we look at the two perfect examples of this, they're both Zelda games, we can understand what I'm talking about. Zelda Twilight Princess, released on the GameCube and on the Wii, because it was initially designed for the GameCube and the GameCube's hardware, but they ended up doing a release on both platforms so that it could launch the Nintendo Wii as their new generation. And the biggest actual difference is the fact that you can use the motion controls for the sword swinging and the slingshot and the bow and arrow and just aiming on the Wii version of Twilight Princess. But on the GameCube version, it's just the standard Zelda, dual analog kind of controls. That's just how they released those. And they had to swap the world for the Wii version because of making Link left-handed with a sword and all that stuff, or right-handed, I guess, so that you could use the Wii remote. So that's the only difference between the Wii and the GameCube version, but at the end of the day, visually, the game is beautiful, don't get me wrong, and it was when it released, but it was visually basically the exact same game on the GameCube and the Wii. The other example, much more recent, is Zelda Breath of the Wild, which was similar to Twilight Princess, designed for the Wii U hardware, and that's why it looks the way it does, and it's beautiful, but it was designed visually for what the Wii U was capable of, and then they basically made a Switch port, and it released same day on the last-gen Wii U and the next-gen Switch. And Breath of the Wild is another case where if you compare those games next to each other, they are virtually the same visually. And it's because both Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild were designed with the prior generation in mind. And when Nintendo decided to release the game on the respective next generation console, the Wii and the Switch, they made minor improvements to the visuals, if any. And I believe Andres had even pointed this out on the podcast, that I think the Switch version of Breath of the Wild might have a slightly better resolution. But I think in general, the animation, the frame rate, the performance, the textures, the art design and art style, everything about the game visually, except for I think there was also some notable sound quality differences. Like the sound quality was a little bit better on the Switch version, which is good, don't get me wrong. But like I said, all these things, the visuals and textures and frame rates, animation, it's the same game almost identically. The minor differences we could find were maybe it's slightly better frame rate in some sections on the Switch version, or if the resolution is like 920 as opposed to 720 or whatever that might be. That's great, but that's not making a next generation jump. You don't see a next generation difference, in my opinion, when you look at the Wii U version and you look at the Switch version of Breath of the Wild. And so when we look at these two examples, we've seen a situation where Nintendo decides to take a game that was designed for one generation, they port it to the launch of their next generation, but visually, they really didn't make any significant next generation changes. And so, naturally, that brings us back to Metroid Prime 4. And again, the assumption that it's going to get a cross-generational release, and they are planning what will be a last-generation Switch, and then a new generation Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4. Again, at the time it releases, because once the Switch 2 is out, the Switch is last generation, so I'm thinking ahead when I refer to them as last generation and new generation. So if that happens, what will Nintendo do? Again, we're all expecting a Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4 to really look next-gen, and to have a sizable visual improvement and difference over a Switch version of Metroid Prime 4, to help get us excited about the next-gen power of the Switch 2, as well as to play the definitive next-gen version of Metroid Prime 4. But what if Nintendo is basically going to do the same thing they did with Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild? And they might make some tweaks to the visuals, but very minor, and maybe some other gameplay tweaks or some bells and whistles tweaks to the Switch 2 version, especially if there are some unique features to the Switch 2 that the Switch doesn't have, whatever they might be. Maybe they modify it for the sake of those gimmicks, the Switch 2 gimmicks. But again, we're mostly talking about graphics and visuals and power. There is a world where I could see Nintendo releasing two versions of Prime 4 that are visually almost the same. So I'll be honest with you guys. My opinion and my takeaway, if that becomes the reality, I'm of two minds when I really think about it. One is that at the end of the day, does it really have to matter? Because A, the game existing at all is all I care about. First and foremost, I just want Metroid Prime 4. I don't care if I'm playing it on an Atari Lynx or my Virtual Boy, which I have sitting right up here out of frame. I have a Virtual Boy right here. I don't care. Release Metroid Prime 4 on the Virtual Boy. At least it was made. I've got a Virtual Boy. I'll play it. So, like I said, main priority is just Metroid Prime 4 existing. And I will be so thrilled to just have the game to play, no matter what console it's on, no matter what it looks like. The other element is, even if it does look the same, I still expect the current Switch version to look absolutely jaw-dropping. Metroid Prime Remastered, again, showed us what's possible, and I expect Prime 4 on the Switch to look even better than that. So it will satisfy what I want. I know it. I know Retro and Nintendo will nail visually a Switch release of Metroid Prime 4. So there's that element. And so even if it looks the same on the Switch 2, it's like, well, it's still probably going to be beautiful, and the game will simply exist, and that's going to satisfy me. But there is something to be said for the excitement and the value in delivering a significant next-gen graphical difference to a next-gen version of Metroid Prime 4. I think we all want that. It justifies the release on the next-generation console, and you want there to be a reason for... You want there to be a game that can showcase what your new Switch 2 new generation power can actually do. And isn't the Metroid franchise one of the best franchises to do that? To exhibit to the world, this is what the Switch 2 is capable of on launch day? I certainly think so. And so, in the same breath, I can say, yes, I would be excited and it's going to be beautiful. But in the same breath, I can say I would also be disappointed if the Switch 2 version doesn't look significantly better than the Switch version. And so, in summary, the last point I want to make here is that we don't really know what Nintendo is planning. The good news is, and I do personally see this as good news, when Nintendo rebooted the game, they scrapped the original version, and they gave it to Retro Studios in 2019, and they basically started from ground zero, as far as we know and as far as we were told, right? Just over 5 years ago. There is a chance that when they did that, they were already cognizant and aware of their next generation plans. Believe it or not, in 2019, 2 years after the Switch had launched, I bet Nintendo was already thinking and planning ahead for whatever the Switch 2 or next generation tech was going to be. So maybe part of the decision with Metroid Prime 4 wasn't just to make a better version of that game with Retro Studios, but also to make it with the Switch 2 or next-gen hardware in mind. And if that's the case, however that game is going to release, whether it's cross-gen or even Switch 2 only, which I don't predict they're doing, but whatever they're doing, if they were accounting for Switch 2 next generation tech at the time they rebooted it in 2019, then that kind of quells my fears. Because maybe that means that Nintendo was already thinking ahead and knew they needed a version of Metroid Prime 4 with Retro Studios at the helm to take advantage of the tech they were going to be building into the Switch 2 way back in 2019. So if that early in development, Nintendo and Retro started accounting for next generation hardware, I think that means that the Switch 2 version, whether it's the only version or if it's one of two versions, hopefully will be maximized and optimized for that next generation hardware. Hopefully this all makes sense, because I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place and I clearly have a lot of passionate feelings about how the eventual release of Metroid Prime 4 might play out. But I have reason to believe, because of that reboot situation in 2019, that hopefully they were prepared to maximize a Switch 2 release of the game. But still, when I look at Nintendo historically, even though Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild were incredible games when they released, two of my favorite games of all time because they're incredible Zelda games, there is something to be said that we've seen them not maximize the power of the next generation console when they port those Zelda games from the last gen to the new gen. They basically released visually identical games on both platforms. So hopefully Metroid Prime 4, if it's cross-generational, again, all speculation, all hypothetical, hopefully they break the mold and break tradition, and they release an incredible Switch version, but an even better, significantly improved Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4. Because again, even if it's identical, I'm going to be thrilled no matter what, but it's also a little bit of a letdown if we end up just getting the same game on both consoles, right? So I'd be curious if you guys would feel the same. If Metroid Prime 4 releases cross-gen, and it's basically identical, if not entirely identical across both platforms, would you be disappointed and let down that the Switch 2 version isn't a visual improvement? Or would you just not care, and you would just be happy to play it regardless of how it looks? Talk about what you think below. This is my thoughts, conversation, my one concern, even though it's not going to kill my hype for the game. So share what you guys think below, and of course subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, like I said, and I'll see you guys next time on another video. Bye-bye.